This talk is specifically deconstructing racism and sexism in the way we construct Western civilization. Because right at the end of the day, the concept of Western civilization is itself a construct. And my goal here is specifically to kind of peel back the layers. Having said that, there's going to be significant overlap with what I've done in the past. So my lecture that I did was it September 12th this semester. There's going to be a little bit of overlap there. I'm going to try not to recreate that lecture, so I probably can't anyway. I probably don't even remember it. And then I've also done a talk called A Very Brief History of Western Civilization. It went on for slightly over 2 hours. People have criticized my calling it a very brief history because they're like, oh my God, it went on so long. But I really needed like 32 hours. So in my mind, it was really brief. Having said that, there's going to be a little bit of overlap there, but again, my goal is not to recreate an old lecture, it's to sort of go in a slightly different route. So if you've seen either of those two lectures, I'm trying to give you a little bit of heads up. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to work on definitions a little bit, just because I feel like we shouldn't start talking about something if we don't know exactly what we're talking about. So Western civilization, I think, is where I want to start, and it's really a fun thing to define precisely because I can do it by just looking at a Western Civ course and using the Western Civ textbook. So Western Civ textbook will start off talking about Sumer and how the Sumerians founded Western civilization. The reason that that's the case is because what the Sumerians did was they invented writing. They invented writing about 5,100 years ago, and the guys who wrote your Western Civ textbook are historians, and all historians are, at the end of the day, is they are literary people who do nonfiction. So the English department does fiction, historians do nonfiction, but in both cases, they're just reading texts, right? The historians claim that they're reading facts, but at the end of the day, what we're doing when we write history is we're writing in what we think took place. So what we're literally doing is we're writing another story, right? And in this case, it's his story as opposed to her story, because the overwhelming vast majority of historians have been men, and they have written it specifically with a male bias. And it's a fun coincidence, history, his story. You know what I mean? Just, you can't ignore that. So historians are going to start their talk about Western civilization with Sumer because without writing, there are no texts to read. And so right away, I'm in trouble with the way they start just because as a political scientist, I'm thrilled that they had writing, but that doesn't seem to me to be a good starting point for a civilization. It seems to me that a civilization is born when you create the first government, right? But that's because I'm a political scientist. I'm obsessed with governments. And so as far as I'm concerned, civilization was started in ancient Egypt about 6,500 years ago with the advent of the first government. But anyway, after they spend maybe 1 or 2 class periods talking about Sumer, they'll jump over to Egypt and they'll spend 1 or 2 class periods talking about Egypt, and then jump into Greece and spend, if it's Western Civ 1, they'll spend a good 5 weeks on Greece, and then from there they'll run over and they'll do the Romans until Rome collapses, although they've got the date screwed up on that by 1,000 years. They're just historians. You wouldn't expect them to get that right. And then, they're just reading the literature, like why would they know anything? And then 1,000 years, they're off by 1,000 years. Anyway, this isn't a small clerical error. This is a problem. And then they just ignore the Middle Ages, right? A very brief talk about the Middle Ages. And then Western Civ 2 starts sometime around 1492, and you just spend an extraordinary, excruciatingly large amount of time talking about how glorious the French and the English really were, and the Spanish, and completely ignoring the people they conquer and slaughter and dominate over that 500 years of brutality. So, what have we gleaned out of this? Well, the reason they have to start with Sumer in Egypt is this. That's who founded Western civilization. So at the end of the day, The Sumerians, when they create writing, and the Egyptians, when they create government, are actually in the process of founding what we call Western civilization. But when I say Western civilization, most of you invoke Europe. You think specifically about Germany, England, maybe you throw in Sweden, because you need a few more blondes in the mix, and throw in France, but a little reluctantly, Spain, very reluctantly, Italy and Greece begrudgingly. Like, you're like, oh, maybe not. They got curly black hair, it's weird. So at the end of the day, there's a little bit of extraordinary racism just in the way you think about what Western Civ is. What you think of West, what you think of Western, what you think of Western civilization really kind of boils down to a skin color and hair color issue, which is remarkable because the guys who are teaching Western Civ admit that Western civilization was founded in Sumer and founded in Egypt. So right away, there's this really weird problem. Also, the way the class is taught by these historians, they spend virtually no time on Sumer or in Egypt. They hit them, get away, and then they just exorbitant amount of time on the Greeks and the Romans. Don't get me wrong, the Greeks and the Romans did really remarkable things, and some time needs to be spent on that. But the ancient Egyptians and the Sumerians also did really remarkable things, and some time probably ought to be spent on that. Almost every musical instrument on earth today was invented in ancient Egypt. The big exception, of course, is piano, which comes from the clavichord and the harpsichord, which comes from the hammer dulcimer, which is actually the santur, which was invented by the Persians. So, and then, of course, the Italians are the ones who created the pianoforte, which is the thing that we think of today. But its evolution starts with the ancient Persians. So there are exceptions to this, but most musical instruments. The ancient Egyptians invented the stone arch. The ancient Egyptians paved the way for the kind of architecture that would eventually lead to the monument structures in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So you would think you'd want to spend a little bit of time focused on that. Also, in the case of the Mesopotamians, they're creating these really remarkable irrigation systems. For example, at one point, the Mesopotamians figured out that the Tigris, I'm pretty sure it's the Tigris, was higher than the Euphrates. So if you wanted to, you could cut a canal from the Tigris to the Euphrates, and you could irrigate all the land in between the two rivers, not just the two river valleys themselves, which like tripled the amount of arable land all of a sudden that they had available to them. And so that type of technology, that type of development is pretty crucial. Also, the Mesopotamians are the guys who gave us our calendar, right? They're the guys who decided that there were 360 degrees in a circle because there were 365 days in a year, and they figured out, right, that there was a circle involved in that. The ancient Egyptians are the guys who figured out the earth was a sphere. And the way they did it was they sent a ship to circumnavigate Africa. And as they sailed south, they noticed that the sun's position in the sky kept going further and further up, right, until it was directly overhead. And then as they crossed the equator, they noticed that the sun was no longer in the south, it was actually in the north. And then when they crossed the equator again on the other side, the sun suddenly was back in the south again. And they were like, well, there's only one possible shape that would make that make sense. The earth must be a sphere. So there are these remarkable discoveries being made. The foundation for the civilization itself is being laid, and we basically ignore it. And then, of course, the Greeks and the Romans get all the attention, which is interesting, because even though they're really important, it ignores then what's happening in Egypt and Mesopotamia at the same time. And what's happening, of course, is that there's this amazing civilization called the Persian Empire. The Achaemenids, who are later on replaced by the Seleucids, who are replaced by the Parthians, who are replaced by the Sassanids. These guys are taking civilization to a whole new level. For example, the guy who founds the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great, Kurosh is the Persian pronunciation of Cyrus. We say Cyrus because the Romans transliterated kappa, which is the letter K. It looks like a K, and it makes a k sound as a C, because in Latin, C's were always pronounced k. They were never pronounced sa. And then the Greeks wrote the name Kurosh as kappa upsilon, because upsilon was frequently an sound, not a y sound. The Romans transliterated the upsilon as a y, and then now it's Cyrus, and we mispronounce it, but it's Kurosh. Kurosh the Great didn't just create an empire, he created an empire that was explicitly and intentionally multicultural. That is to say, it embraced all the civilizations that it made contact with and conquered. So you would get conquered militarily. An army would invade your country and conquer you. And then, instead of doing what the Romans would do, which was subjugate you, enslave a portion of your population, steal all your technology, steal all your wealth, smash up your temples, and then force the survivors to assimilate, because the Romans were the original Borg. Instead of doing that, what the Persians would do is they'd go, welcome to the empire. You are now beneficiaries of the empire. And that means you get all the rights. All the rights, because the Persians are also the first people to invent a Bill of Rights. Cyrus the Great walked around translating his Bill of Rights into every language for every nation in the empire, so that everybody would know what their rights were. That's a huge innovation, giving the citizens of a place rights against the state. And yet, we don't get taught about the Persians at all. If they're mentioned, there's some sort of villainous outsider force that the Romans and the Greeks have to fight. They're stuck fighting. But when you think about what I just said, when the Romans went into a place like, for example, Gaul, when Gaius Julius Caesar, you guys know him as Julius Caesar, like we mispronounce everything. It's almost like it's on purpose. And then people are like, the Turks say Istanbul for Constantinople, isn't that terrible? Dude, you can't even get Caesar right, it's Kaiser. Like, come on. Anyway, don't point fingers anymore. It's not even C-E-A, it's C-A-E. Like, how did you get out of that? It should, at least you'd say Kaiser. So Gaius Julius Caesar invades Gaul. When he did, there were 3 million people living there. He killed 1 million outright because he was a genocidal maniac. He enslaved another 1 million and sold them into slavery and made a lot of money doing that. And then told the remaining 1 million, welcome to the Roman Republic. It wasn't even an empire yet. Oh, and it'd be great if you learned Latin and started worshiping our gods. Right? We learn about that guy and we're told that he's some sort of crazy, amazing hero. And we keep retelling his story over and over and over again in film, in TV series, in literature. He was a psychopath who murdered 1/3 of Gaul's population. If he was alive in the 19th century, we would be comparing him to Hitler. We wouldn't be talking about like, well, Jack Kennedy was the Julius Caesar of our time. Like, no, you wouldn't do that to Jack Kennedy because he was this really horrible human being. By contrast, the Persians conquer a place and they're like, here's your rights. We translated it into your language. Oh, and by the way, because we believe in freedom of religion, we fund the reconstruction of any damaged temples. It's on us. So for example, one of the things that the Neo-Babylonian Empire had done when it conquered Palestine was it tore down the Temple of Solomon. It went to this Jewish temple in Jerusalem and just tore it down. And so the Jews went, wait, are you serious? They had been enslaved in the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is why Kurosh shows up in the Old Testament, because he's the one who frees the Jews from the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Because in the Bill of Rights that he created, there's no slavery. It's not permitted. So he goes and he frees the slaves. So the Jews go, okay, that was cool, thanks for freeing us. You were serious about building this temple, rebuilding our temples, right, restoring them on your money? And Cyrus is like, yeah. And so they go and they draft plans for a temple that had never been built. And they show it to the Persians and they go, this is what the Neo-Babylonians tore down. And the Persians go, what the hell? That's a man-made mountain. They tore that down? Yeah, they really hated us. And so the Persians were like, okay, I guess we have to rebuild it. The only people on earth who could rebuild something like that were, of course, the ancient Egyptians. And so the Persians went, they got Egyptian engineers, they brought them to Palestine, and with Persian gold, they built the Temple Mount, which is a massive mesa, right? They basically made a man-made mesa, and then they put a small little temple on top. And they built the second Temple of Solomon. All of that history gets lost when you don't talk about this history because you don't want to talk about the other side, right? Because at the end of the day, the major framework around what is Western civilization, that question was framed by people who had a very specific agenda. And it was to write out, it was to delete whole chunks of history. Their goal was to erase, in this case, the Persians. But it doesn't stop there. So the Roman Empire, we are told, collapses on September 4, 476 AD. What's remarkable to me about that is there's such a precise date, right? But then in school, this is what I was taught. I don't know if you were taught this, but I suspect you were. In school, you were probably taught, and we don't know why. But then, we don't stop there. We actually go and we go, hey, why do you think it collapsed? And if you read the readings, you read, oh, there was lead in the pipes, and they did gladiatorial fighting, and they became a lazy society, and people just sort of sat around all day eating peeled grapes, and they had slaves, right? And there's all these, and then you're supposed to come up with an opinion, which is an exercise in not knowing anything and then still expressing an opinion. I have never understood this need that the American public school education system has to try to get you to talk about stuff you know nothing about. Especially because the textbook is just a little propaganda instrument that they, where they went through and they deleted Thomas Jefferson, and they deleted Helen Keller, and they deleted Hillary Clinton, and they went, here's your history. Go read this, you'll know everything you need to know. Right? And so they tell you, okay, there was lead in the pipes, and they were gladiating. The Romans stopped gladiating well before 476. In fact, Commodus, the emperor who's famous for being the gladiator emperor, right? Commodus not brought back gladiatorial fighting. He was Marcus Aurelius' son. Commodus brought back gladiatorial fighting in the 2nd century AD because he thought it was so cool. So if Rome collapsed in 476, that's the 5th century, and it was brought back in the 2nd century after it had been done away with, what does that have to do with Rome's collapse? There's 3 centuries between the end of gladiatorial fighting and Rome's collapse. And one of the reasons why it goes away with Commodus again is because he's in the arena fighting. He's the emperor, right? He gets killed. He was probably assassinated, but he gets killed. So, lesson learned, okay, we got to stop the gladiatorial fighting. It's bad when emperors die in the arena. Commodus gets a really bad portrayal in that Marcus Aurelius movie, Gladiator. Just that was one of those moments. I don't think he was quite that villainous. I just think he was a little, yeah, right, yeah. I think he was just a little, he was an adrenaline junkie. I don't think he was as mean and evil as they portrayed him in the film. Maybe not the best leader to have, considering he's spending so much time in the arena when he probably should have just been ruling the empire. But I'd be for bringing back gladiatorial fighting if our leaders would go in the arena. And if they would do a little bit less ruling. All for it. I would referee it. Wouldn't that be something? Yep. He swung too late. Oh, well, didn't need that, Senator. Okay, so this 476 event is sort of weird because, first of all, there's this exercise in you don't know anything about the topic matter. Why are you expressing an opinion? Why are you being asked to express opinion? And then, inevitably, usually it was males, would raise their hand and they would say, oh, I think it was the lead in the pipes. By the way, we have lead in our pipes too. Calcium builds up on the inside of the pipes and it protects us from the lead. The reason why that worked out so poorly for Flint is because the city was running out of money. Why was the city running out of money? Because there was Reaganomics. Reaganomics taught the world that if you cut taxes, it would stimulate the economy. We cut taxes, the economy did not get stimulated, I mean, it did it temporarily, but actually long-term it had a negative effect. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but that's the really cool thing about economics. You probably need a PhD to understand what's really going on, which is why it's really remarkable that a bunch of people without PhDs are expressing opinions about this topic that's so complicated that the average PhD in economics still doesn't know what's going on, right? This is just a really weird thing that's completely counterintuitive. Like, I still can't figure out how our economy functions considering we produce almost nothing. But after the tariffs are fully in effect, I'm sure that'll fix it. Like fixes in neuter, you know what I mean? I don't mean fixes and make better. So, did you like the scissors? I just feel like that should always be the symbol for fix. Here's what's remarkable about all of this. The reason why your teachers didn't know why Rome fell, the reason why this was such an incredible mystery, is because Rome didn't fall. It's really hard to explain something when it doesn't happen. I mean, you're giving the date 476, but September 4, it's a specific day. You would think if something happened, and you knew the day it happened, all you'd need to do is go look at what happened on that day to find out why Rome collapsed. Oh, I didn't finish the lead pipes. So what happened with Flint was they cut their taxes, right? But they expected all the services. This is the epitome of irrationality. You're going to cut the funding for all the services, and then you expect all the services, so cities start going into crazy debt. To compensate, cities began to rely very heavily on police to issue tickets. When you think about it, it's outrageous that the police spend so much time issuing tickets. Why aren't they out there fighting crime or something, doing something useful? Instead, they're like predators hanging out on the roads waiting for you to make a mistake so they can zap you. The reason is because they have to compensate for the fact that you voted for politicians who cut your taxes. Because you still expect all the services, like fresh water, pumped into your home. That's totally a luxury, by the way. In any case, to compensate for this, the city decided to switch over to a cheaper source of water. The cheaper source of water, instead of it being hard water, was soft water, and what it did was it eroded the calcium lining away. And as a result, exposed the lead. And then because it was soft water, it tore the lead out. And it actually dumped it into the water supply. In other words, this whole event in Flint was totally engineered by really dumb politicians and even dumber voters. This is a self-inflicted wound that 4 years on still hasn't been fixed. Flint still doesn't have proper drinking water. And one of the reasons is, even if you switched over to a hard water source, it's going to take years for the calcium to build up. It's not like there's an instant fix that's easy to do. So back to 476. So I looked it up. You're wondering, what happened on September 4? Surely something cool happened. This is what happened. There was a German general. His name was Odo Wacker. It looks like Odo Acer because it's A-C-E-R, that last part. And there's no, in Latin, there was no va. So when Gaius Julius Caesar said, Veni vidi vici, he didn't say that. He said, Veni vidi vici. Veni vidi wiki, just for the record. It doesn't sound as cool, though. Veni vidi wiki. Right, Veni vidi vici sounds so much better. I came, I saw, I conquered. Julius Caesar's famous saying. His men had a saying about him. He's a husband to all women and a wife to all men. Because it just wasn't an issue with the Roman Empire. They didn't care. There was this whole you need to fit into a box around your sexuality thing just started like 150 years ago. Human beings didn't used to get all freaked out about what you were doing with your stuff. Like it was just do it, whatever, who cares? And then all of a sudden 150 years ago, everybody became super obsessed. What are you doing? You put that there? That's wrong. That's wrong. It's like, no, I have a better idea. Why don't you just get a life? Or, not worrying about what other people are doing. So I looked it up, September 4. Odo Wacker goes to the western Roman Senate. There were 2 senates and 2 emperors. The Western Roman emperor was a guy named Romulus Augustus. He grabbed him. He was 16. Odovaker had just kicked the Roman army's ass in battle. He grabs Romulus Augustus. He goes over to the Western Senate, and he says, do we really need 2 emperors? Can't we just have one? And the Western Roman Senate goes, let's vote on it. They debate it. They vote on it. And they vote to just have 1 Roman emperor. They make Romulus Augustus take off his robes. They were purple, and that was because purple dye was extremely rare, and there were actually laws about how much purple you could have on your clothing. And your rank and your wealth allowed you to have a larger and larger amount. So if you had a robe, like, you got a little swath of purple somewhere on your robe, that gave you rank. So he had, because he was an emperor, solid purple robes. Right? They take off his solid purple robes, which are worth more than their weight in gold multiple times, pack it in a little FedEx box, and sent it DHL, just to screw with everybody, to Constantinople, where the other emperor, Emperor Zeno, was, with a note attached going, we voted to dissolve the Western Roman emperor. We're going to still have 2 Roman senates, but just 1 emperor. You're our emperor, Emperor Zeno. Hail, Emperor Zeno. Zeno opens up the box, sees the robe, sees the note, writes back and goes, this is ridiculous. I can't run this whole show. Please keep another emperor. So he convinces Odovaker to keep another emperor. Odovaker goes, fine. Odovaker declares himself to be the king of Italy, declares that Italy is still part of the Roman Empire, that Zeno is still his emperor. He acknowledges the new emperor that he doesn't want, and then orders that new emperor never to set foot in Italy. And then the Ostrogoths eventually moved their capital from Milan, it wasn't even in Rome anymore, to Ravenna. And they actually run Italy from Ravenna as part of the Roman Empire. And then eventually that emperor, I can't remember his name offhand, dies in Dalmatia, having never set foot in Italy. Odovaker even minted coins with his image, with this emperor's image and name on it, but the guy never functioned as an emperor. Odovaker then gets killed by Theodoric, a general, a rival general of his, who convinces Odovaker to accept there being 2 kings instead of 1. Odovaker accepts. They have a banquet to celebrate, and Theodoric kills him and becomes the only king of Italy. That's all that happened. Rome didn't fall. What they did was they dissolved one of the emperors. In reality, although on paper there was still 2. That's it, and the Romans became, Italy became ruled by German kings, but it was still part of the Roman Empire. So I said it was off by 1,000 years. So I can tell you the exact day and year that the Roman Empire fell, and I can even explain to you why, because I know what happened that day. It's May 29, 1453. 1453, not 476. It's not quite 1,000 years, but it's close enough. That's a big error. And I'll tell you what happened on that day. Emperor Constantine the 11th got the last of his army destroyed, and the Ottoman Empire captured the city of Constantinople. And at that point, that's all Rome owned. The Roman Empire had been reduced to a city-state. It literally just had its capital. Everything else was gone. And Emperor Constantine has an heir who's out in the countryside somewhere. He declares he's the new emperor. He runs around. He gets replaced. There are multiple coups d'etats to take out these last emperors. And for 7 years, Roman rebels are out in the countryside controlling nothing, claiming that they're still in it, when in reality they weren't. And so in 1460, the last Roman emperor, but he'd only been Roman emperor on paper because Constantine the 11th was the last real Roman emperor. But the last fake Roman emperor surrenders. So it doesn't matter which year you use, 1453 or 1460, it's still off by about 1,000 years. Now, here's the twist on all of this. There's the question you have to ask, why do this? Why teach us the history so wrong and then make an exercise about developing an opinion about a topic that's wrong. They actually spent time trying to get you to explain why something happened that didn't happen. And so here's my hypothesis. There's a term that I haven't used, but I'm going to use it now because I want to bring it up. Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire came into being in the 16th century. It was created by a German historian. There was no reference to the Byzantine Empire ever while there was a Byzantine Empire, because there never was a Byzantine Empire. What happened was this German historian decided to divorce Rome of its last 1,000 years of history. And so what he said was, on September 4, 476, the Roman Empire ceased to exist and was replaced by the Byzantine Empire. The thing that he's calling the Byzantine Empire called itself the Roman Empire until the day it died. It used Roman symbolism. They had switched languages. They stopped using Latin and they had switched to Greek early 600s, like 610-ish. I think right around the year 610. It was Heraclius who did it. So it was after 610, because I think Heraclius took over in 610 AD. So sometime shortly after 610 AD, Emperor Heraclius switched the official language of the Roman Empire from Latin to Greek. But other than that, and they called themselves Romans. So if you were to go to Thrace and walk up to a person who was ethnically Greek and say, "What are you?" he would have said, "I'm Romanoi. I'm Roman." He would have said it in Greek. "I'm a Roman in Greek." And then if you were to put him on a ship and take him to Italy, and you were to go to the city of Rome, which by that time was a town of about 35,000 people because the city had effectively been abandoned, and you were to walk up to a Roman in Rome, and you were to poke him and go, "What is this guy?" The Greek guy who calls himself a Roman would have said ethnikos. He's an ethnic. They were so Roman, they thought they were the real Romans and thought the Italians were ethnics. They were from a different race, right? So the word Byzantine is concocted and used specifically for those last 10 centuries. And here's why. One, Otto Wacker, that German general who takes over Italy and becomes king, and then gets replaced by another German general, Theodoric. They're Germans. This German historian loved the idea that a German took out the Roman Empire. It's not true, it didn't happen, but that doesn't mean he can't lie about it. There's another reason to do this. Who does put down the Roman Empire? It's the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Ottoman Empire. So if you have Rome fall in 476, and then you have the Byzantine Empire fall in 1453, then the Germans get the credit for destroying the Roman Empire, and therefore the Germans become the heirs to the Roman Empire. And in fact, at the time he's writing this, there is a thing called the Holy Roman Empire. And now Napoleon Bonaparte dissolves the Holy Roman Empire, and as he does, he declares, it is not Holy Roman or an empire. And it's true, it definitely wasn't holy. It wasn't Roman, it was German. And it wasn't an empire, it was a confederacy, which is almost the opposite of an empire. What should have been called was the Unholy German Confederacy. Just for the record, in case some of you are feeling a sting like you're German or Italian or something and you feel like I'm being too rough with Rome and Germany, I'm part Italian, I'm part German, so it's okay, get over yourself, no one cares. We're all equally worthless. No one cares about your ancestry except you when you take 23andMe and you find out whatever. Except me, I'm curious, I always want to know, especially when you just reconfirm what we've always believed about you anyway. But then that's kind of it at the end of the day. Anyway, I know you're going to spend all this time building your family tree. Good. It'll help you identify the DNA and who cares? I mean, I'm obsessed, but I don't expect you to be obsessed about my ancestry. You know what I mean? Mostly I'm obsessed. I was really super obsessed in the beginning because I was hoping that I was adopted. Turns out I'm not. I really am a Casagranda. I'm still working on that in therapy. And for the longest time, I just thought, oh, this is terrible. But I just discovered, because of taking 23andMe, that I have a cousin that I didn't know about, because he was adopted. But he's actually a Casagranda. And we've been in contact, and he is the loveliest human being. I am madly in love with this cousin. And it's the best $100 I've ever spent. And just for the record, it proves to me that it isn't necessarily my bad DNA, it's my bad environment, right? Because this guy is Casagranda, and he turned out just fine. So there's hope for my children. I'm going to have to get them adopted. But anyway, so the twist here is this German historian had an agenda. He wanted to divorce Rome from its ignominious defeat at the hands of Muslims and wanted to attach it to the Germans so that they could help justify the existence of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't a Roman Empire. It was called that so that they could steal the glory of Rome. By the way, the Holy Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years, so it had a good run. It's just, it wasn't what it claimed to be. So, in the midst of all of this, something else is going on. And that is this. We were taught that the Middle Ages was this terrible time. In fact, what we're told is it was the Dark Ages. So Tetrarch is the guy who coined the term Dark Ages. And the reason he called the Dark Ages, which he just really intended for like the 6th century, 7th century, and 8th century. He only meant it for about 3 centuries. So the medieval period lasts about 10 centuries. He only meant the first 3 of those 10 centuries. The reason he coined the phrase Dark Ages was because he said there wasn't a lot of literature produced in that time period, which is, by the way, accurate. There really wasn't a lot of literature produced in that time period. And so he called it the Dark Ages for literature. But what happened was we decided, no, it's just the Dark Ages. Boom. And that was the end of it. What was actually happening was the birth of a new civilization, and that civilization was the Arab civilization. The Arabs were, in fact, in the process of putting together their empire that they had carved out of the Roman Empire and attached it to the Persian Empire, 2 empires that they had conquered. And they were in the process now of translating all the texts that they had in those libraries into Arabic. And they really only start to get some serious successes in the 8th century and beginning of the 9th century. And that's where the literature is coming from. It's coming from the Arab world. And by the time we get to the 11th century, the Arabs have actually done some remarkable stuff. They invented modern agriculture. They invented modern medicine. They're the first guys to put ice on a ship and pack fresh food on top of the ice and then use it to distribute fresh food across the Indian Ocean. They're the guys who figured out the coffee industry. They're the guys who set up a mass distribution network for sugar. They built the first large-scale dam so that they could irrigate higher ground. They're the guys who set up the first water wheels so that you could power stuff, like you could power a mill, for example, using a water wheel. They figured out lenses. They created the first camera. They were doing cataract surgery. They're the guys who realized that prevention was better than medicine. They're the guys who figured out all objects in the universe exert gravity on all other objects in the universe. They're the guys who realized that light had a finite speed, that it traveled in waves, that it could be broken up into its constituent colors. They invented the world's first ever scientific method, 600 years before Bacon does it again. They stated Newton's first law of motion 600 years before Newton, Kepler's first law of planetary motion 500 years before Kepler, right? Remarkable stuff. You've never heard of it before, because that too got written out of history. That the Arabs don't count. They don't get mentioned. And what's really remarkable about all of that is the Arabs didn't come out of nowhere and conquer some foreign place. They conquered most of the Roman Empire and all of the Persian Empire. Now, I've already talked about how the Persian Empire had been divorced from the West, but what the Arabs ended up with then is Egypt and Mesopotamia, the birthplace of Western civilization. So for me, what happened personally, and the reason I'm bringing it personal is because I'm going to try and take it to the other topic, which is the sexism topic now. Now I'm sort of laying out the foundation for the racism, I want to pull it over to the sexism. Because at the end of the day, writing the Persians out, changing the Roman Empire's name in the last 1,000 years, all of that stuff is racist. It's designed specifically to write out an entire people and all their achievements, while at the same time stealing their stuff and pretending they don't exist. So what ends up happening is the Arabs create all of this, right? They develop all of this technology, but they're Muslim. And they're doing it on top of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the very foundational places for the Western civilization. It's not like they erased the achievements of Western civilization. They absorbed them. They didn't destroy the Roman Empire and then level it and start over. They built upon it to the point where the original coins they minted, they just put Roman emperors on it because they didn't know what to put on their coins. If you go get the original Arab coins, they just had Roman emperors on it. And in fact, the word fulus in Arabic means money. It comes from the Latin folus, which was a denomination of coin. A little twist, folus meant scrotum, and for some reason the Romans called one of the denominations of coin scrotum. And so whenever Arabs say fulus, they're just actually saying scrotum, which is really embarrassing. But now, as time goes by, people will find this out because they'll watch this lecture, and then they'll start trying to say other words for. There's hypotheses I've heard that the purse that the Romans would put their coins in looked vaguely like a scrotum. I'm not seeing it. I'm not. Anyway, it's a little disturbing. So. So we end up with this situation where we lose the Arabs. So here's what happened to me. So I was about 18. I was already obsessed with history and politics. So I was always a nerd. And I noticed something. I knew all this Greek history. I knew all this Roman history. I knew a lot of Egyptian history because I was super interested in it. And I even knew some medieval history. And then I thought, this is really weird. I know all this history about the Middle East during the Roman period and about the Middle East during the Egyptian period. And I know all this medieval history, but I don't know anything about the Middle East during the medieval period. How's that possible? It's like the Middle East just vanished. And then it doesn't show up again in the textbooks until the Europeans conquer it post-World War I. And then, then it can't stop talking about the Middle East. So I went to the library and I pulled out a book on the Arabs. It was written by Sir John Bagot Glubb Basha. His real name was just John Bagot Glubb. But anyway, the Basha and the Sir, of course, were titles. And he was a British soldier who, when Transjordan got its independence and eventually got renamed Jordan, decided to stay. He went native, or as we would say in the United States, gone Injun. He'd gone Injun. And he became a general in the Transjordanian army. He was an Arabophile. He loved Arab culture. He loved Arab history. And he wrote a series of books about the Arabs. And I read them. And I couldn't believe it. Like, oh my God, how did this history get lost? And of course, the answer was it wasn't lost. It was intentionally ignored. It was intentionally dropped. We didn't want you to know that there was this thriving civilization that put lamps up that were powered by petroleum 1,000 years ago, and were doing cataract surgery 1,000 years ago, while Europeans were living in little towns like Paris, where the streets were literally their sewage system, right? And they would just throw the fecal matter and urine out the window, and it would flow in the rain into the wells, which is why they couldn't drink their water, because you just die of cholera and dysentery instantaneously if you did, which meant that during that time period, Europeans could only drink beer and wine, and so they were constantly drunk. But it's okay, they smelled like fecal matter and urine, so it was a way to compensate, I think. That, and they had to wear wool, so they were always walking around itching. And so you smelled like poop and piss, and you're itching, so you might as well be drunk. So, fast forward. I decided I was going to take on Walter Mosley. So Walter Mosley is an interesting author who has quite a personality. That's why I'm saying interesting. You can look him up. This lecture isn't about Walter Mosley, and I'm certainly no expert on him. So he said, you don't exist until you're in the literature. And that doesn't include history books. And I realized instantaneously that that was going to be my favorite ever quote, because it's totally true, right? So like those Arabs I was just talking about, they don't exist until they're in public discourse. It doesn't matter how many historians know about them, right? The Byzantine Empire exists because it's in the public discourse, even though it didn't exist. In other words, if you can get people to talk about a thing, you can make it exist even if it didn't. If you can get people to not talk about a thing, you can make it disappear. And this is because people don't read history, they read literature. Now, of course, we do movies too, so it'd be great to get into movies as well, but to do that you have to have a lot of money. But literature, I realized I have a chance at this. So I set out to write at least a novel. And my goal was, initially, to write a novel set about 1,500 years ago in the 6th century, when Rome didn't collapse, right? A century after Rome didn't collapse. And, you know, I'm talking about this Roman soldier. Here he is, 100 years after Rome didn't fall. And my thinking was that we kind of get a little bit of a conversation going. Having said that, as I was doing the research on this, and I actually wrote a first draft of this novel. As I was doing the research on it, I started to notice a really weird thing popping up. These women I had never heard of before. They would just, boop, oh, look, there's one, boop, there's another one. And I'd read their story, and I'd go, oh my God, this is so much more interesting than the thing I'm writing right now. Like Zenobia. Zenobia is 3rd century AD. She's a princess out in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, today's Syria. And the Roman Empire is in serious trouble. It's starting to unravel. It is poorly ruled. Things are just in bad shape. It's literally on the verge of collapse. There was this guy, Galabulus. Did I say it right? Galabulus. Anyway, he was like this 16-year-old who becomes emperor, and all he does is have sex. Like he's the ultimate man whore. He's just crazy nonstop sex. That's all he did. And eventually his guards kill him. They're like, dude, you gotta go. We're gonna have to have somebody who rules occasionally. And so they just stab him to death, which is a good appropriate measure for that kind of Elagabalus, that's it. I was leaving the L. Elagabalus. They stab him to death, and then what ends up happening is a series of coups, and there's one unstable emperor after another, and they get involved in these terrible wars with the Persians, and the Persians are just beating the snot out of the Romans, and it's just a bad century. The 3rd century AD, catastrophe for the Romans. And by the way, it's in the aftermath of Commodus, so maybe having emperors in the arena, getting stabbed by gladiators wasn't a good idea, right? So you could get mad at Commodus. In the aftermath of all of this, Rome literally starts to break apart. The northwestern chunk breaks off and declares its independence, and Zenobia decides in the chaos that she's going to do something similar. She declares the eastern part of the Roman Empire to break away. She makes her capital Palmyra, and she marches an army all the way to Egypt, conquers it, turns around, goes up, conquers Turkey. So she owns all of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. She starts minting coins with the image of her son and the emperor on it, and claims that her son is just co-emperor with the other emperor, and that they're working. It's not true at all. She was just ruling her own little empire, and then she dies. And the Romans reconquer her territory, and they reconquer the northwestern part of the empire. It's a guy named Diocletian who pulls this off, and then Diocletian splits the empire into 4 pieces, not 2, 4. 2 will be ruled by Caesars, and 2 will be ruled by Augustus's, and that's what creates the Tetrarchy, where that eventually gets dissolved in 476 when the Western Roman Empire, or Senate sends the robes back with a note saying, we're done, right? That's that whole thing. But I'm sitting here reading Zenobia's story going, how come I've never heard of Zenobia? This is really cool. Who is this person? And I kept digging, not specifically looking for women necessarily, but I started noticing other women popping up. For example, Cleopatra VII, you all know her story. You don't know 1 through 6, though. And each of those was interesting. And to make things more interesting, there was a Berenica as well. And several Berenicas, actually. And each of those is interesting. And so I started to notice there was this really strange pattern on how many of these women I had never heard of, and how each and every single one of them was a total badass. And then I ran upon Artemisia. And Artemisia I, there's also an Artemisia II, and there's an Ada, too, just to make things really interesting. The satrapy of Caria, which is the southwestern corner of Turkey, ended up getting ruled by Artemisia I. Artemisia I was the first woman to rule Greeks. She was the first woman satrap of the Persian Empire, and she was an admiral who led men and ships into battle on around 6 different occasions, maybe more. And I'm like, how come I've never heard of this person? She's super cool. There's clearly something going on here. And then there's Artemisia II. Her husband was Mausolus. Mausolus dies. She wants to build a thing for him to remember him. And because his name was Mausolus, she calls the thing she builds to commemorate him a mausoleum. And that's where we get the term mausoleum from. It's from Mausolus. And then she gets replaced by her sister Ada, who becomes her own ruler. And I'm like, oh my God, there's just layer after layer after layer. And then, of course, I'm not even talking about the women who didn't rule on their own, but were seriously influential. The women who, they weren't by themselves. They had an emperor or a king, but they were still involved, very heavily involved in politics, like Empress Theodora from Emperor Justinian I, right? Later on, again, after the Roman Empire has collapsed, right? Because Rome doesn't exist anymore, but somehow it has Roman emperors. It's so weird. So weird. It's just so weird. There's a woman named Irene, but we would say Irene. Irene of Athens, Irene. And she ruled as an empress on her own without an emperor. And I'm thinking, what's going on? And so here's what I think happened. This is my hypothesis. There's a couple of things going on. First of all, we need to examine who the historians were. So one of the things that happened was we lost a lot of texts. And the reason we lost those texts was because Christianity decided in 387 AD that there was no room for non-Christians in the Roman Empire, that the Roman Empire was an exclusively Christian undertaking. And the response to that was in Alexandria in 391 with the burning of the Great Library. By losing the Great Library, we lost a lot of texts. And so probably we would know more about people like Artemisia I if we had some of those texts. To make things worse, even before this had happened, when Alexander the Great captured Takhta Jamshid, which we call Persepolis, he burnt their library. And so we lost a bunch of texts from that event as well. So there were these 2 absolutely catastrophic library burning events. One during the Roman Empire, one from the Persian Empire, but it was done by a Greek. And those two burning events destroyed a lot of history for us. But it was worse than that. Because one of the things that happened was there was an agenda to frame history in a certain way. So for example, Augustine of Hippo says in 410 that the Library of Alexandria wasn't burnt by a Christian mob. So that tells us two things. One, that the Library of Alexandria was burnt. Otherwise, why would he be saying this? Two, that everybody was blaming a Christian mob. We know that the Archbishop of Alexandria, Theophilus I, ordered the city to be Christian only and ordered the public, the Christian public, to get rid of its Jewish and pagan citizens. We know that Hypatia was the last director of the Great Library, and we know she dies in 415 when monks murder her. That time it was ordered by Archbishop Cyrillus. So we know a few things. We also know that the Academy in Athens was refounded in an attempt to replace the burnt Great Library. And I think that was around 410 as well. So we have some evidence that points towards a 391, 392 burning. But what's really interesting about what Augustine of Hippo is doing by declaring a Christian mob didn't burn this is he's planting himself as a witness saying, yeah, something happened, it was terrible, it's so sad, but it wasn't us, we didn't do it. So now people who are around today will cite him as evidence that it wasn't burnt then, and will try to blame it on somebody else. Originally, it was blamed on an Arab named Amr ibn al-As. Now, that didn't make any sense because Amr ibn al-As was fighting in Egypt in the late 630s, so the library was clearly burnt by 410. That's 220-something years off, so it doesn't work. And so eventually what happened was people who are trying to pin this on somebody other than a Christian mob then went out of their way to blame it on Julius Caesar. Now that's true. Julius Caesar did catch the library on fire, but then there's still another 4 centuries of directors, and we know their names. There's a list of them. So what that means is it was damaged. They fixed the damage, and the library continued on. So I'm not saying Julius Caesar didn't set the library on fire. I'm saying that Julius Caesar didn't destroy the library. And since Hypatia is the last director, and she's murdered in 415, and there are no subsequent directors, it seems likely then that in 410, by 410, that was the death blow. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is Hypatia also has been largely written out of history. And the events surrounding her have been written out of history. So then I got to thinking about my source for Artemisia. So my primary source is Herodotus. He's my primary, he's kind of my only source. Because, like I said, most of the texts are destroyed, so there really aren't any other sources from the time period. It turns out there are other sources, but they were written a century or two later. Where did they get their information from? It is possible they got them from secondary sources, but it's also possible that they just screwed up Herodotus' story, and so they're a lot less reliable. Herodotus says stuff that's too remarkable to be true, right? So for example, he says that when dogs drank from the Nile, they ran. So I need you to get a dog in your head, and it's running alongside a riverbank with its mouth open and its tongue in a river, and it's running. And the reason Herodotus says this is because there were so many crocodiles in the Nile. If a dog stood still to drink from the Nile, a crocodile would eat it. Obviously, dogs aren't running and drinking at the same time. I don't know how that would work. So we have a problem right away with Herodotus' accounts of things. Another one that he does is he says the Persians, whenever they made a decision, would have to make it twice. They would get together and they would vote, and if it passed, they would get together in the evening for a second vote, but first they got drunk out of their minds, and then they would vote again. And they would only do a thing if it passed sober and then passed drunk. Now, I gotta tell you, I think that's really cool. I'm kind of on board with this, but it's also almost certainly not true. Like almost certainly as in 99.99%. So one of the problems that you run into with Herodotus automatically is he's saying stuff that we're pretty sure isn't true, like the dogs running on the Nile and drinking. But then he says other stuff. So for example, he has Amistris. So Amistris is Xerxes' wife, first wife. He has Amistris get really, really jealous when the daughter of Otanes, one of the highest ranked nobles in the Persian Empire, sleeps with Xerxes. So to punish this woman, she goes and grabs the woman's mother, cuts off her ears, nose, lips, eyelids, and I think she may have cut off her fingers too, just to make sure, and then lets her go. So on the surface of it, you go, wow, that Amistris was a really nasty human being. Except there's a really weird problem here. That's a recycled myth. It could have happened, but it was from an ancient Mesopotamian mythological story where some goddess gets really mad because her husband goes and sleeps with some mortal, and so to punish the mortal, she punishes the mortal's mom. In other words, Herodotus recycled an ancient myth and then applied it to people living during his time period, which almost certainly means it didn't happen. So then you're stuck asking the question, what was his motivation? Another thing he does with Amistris, just since we're on her, is he accuses her of executing, I shouldn't say executing, human sacrifice. He accuses her of grabbing a group of young people to celebrate her coronation as empress of the Persian Empire, and she has them sacrificed to the gods. Well, that's probably not true either, and here's why. Remember I told you Cyrus the Great created that Bill of Rights? Part of that Bill of Rights was not only the abolition of slavery, it also said no more human sacrifice. If you are in the Persian Empire, you cannot do this. Now you can say, well, it could have been violated. Yeah, in the same way that you would violate the Constitution today. It is possible. It seems unlikely. Right? But because there's that myth story that he recycled, and now he's accusing her of something that's strictly forbidden, everything he writes in my mind is now questioned. That's not to say that he's never truthful, but it starts to look like he has an agenda. And the agenda is to portray the Persians in a really negative way. At one point, he has Xerxes whip the Aegean Sea to punish it, because some of Xerxes' ships were sunk, and so he sends people to the sea with whips, and they whip, right? He's making Xerxes look like a buffoon. This almost certainly did not happen. Xerxes did build two parallel ship bridges across the Dardanelles. So there's the Dardanelles Straits, right? There's the Bosporus, and then there's the Dardanelles. And he built these two, he took ships and they bound them together. Well, to do this is a remarkable feat. When you think about it, it's like the first trans-sea bridge. It's really remarkable, especially because there's a big current. The water is literally flowing there. And so the ships were actually bowed because they were bent by the current. And it's several miles, so I want to say it was over 2 miles. So you're just taking these ships and sticking them together, but they have to be flexible because they're being pushed by the current, but they also have to be strong because you're running a whole army across them, right? You're going to have thousands of men on that thing at the same time. And so it was actually quite a feat. And Herodotus tells us he had one rope. And he tied all the ships together with one rope. Like it's several miles rope. How is that possible? How do they make that rope? But more importantly, how did they move it? Like the thing would have weighed tons coiled up. Like how did they get it there and then unroll it? It would have been tons of rope unrolled. It would have sunk the ships. In other words, his credibility is bad because he also gets these details wrong. It's just not possible. what they almost certainly did was they put planks in between the aft and prow of every ship, and then had a rope on either side of the planks to hold the ships more or less stable. They didn't need to have one single rope. It's unnecessary. Not only is it impossible, it's unnecessary. And so, as I'm reading Herodotus, I'm starting to have a little bit of trouble with him. So I'm wondering why. What's his goal here? So here's what I came up with. So it's important to take a step forward, actually, from Herodotus and look at Plato and Aristotle. And the reason I'm looking at Plato and Aristotle, they're after Herodotus, is because Plato and Aristotle tell us a lot about what the Greeks thought about women. By the way, just for the record, Plato, Homer, Panyasis, those are the three that come to mind. I'm sure there's more. All tell us that the Greeks did human sacrifice, something that we're always careful to ignore when we talk about the Greeks. And we now have the archaeological evidence that they did, because we found sacrificed skeletal remains beneath a temple to Zeus. So they at least did it on occasion, just for the record. Whereas the Persians, it was completely banned. So, Plato. Plato has a play called the Symposium. And the subject matter to be discussed at the symposium is, in fact, love. It's interesting that none of the people there to speak about love are women. It's just going to be a conversation entirely held by men about love. It was like when Congress decided to have a conversation about abortion in 2012, and they only invited men. And then finally, in the last minute, they were like, all right, let's find one woman. And they randomly picked some grad student, and then they slut-shamed her as she talked about abortion. It's incredible. It's like, wow. That women don't burn the United States to the ground blows my mind on a daily basis. Y'all have a patience that I cannot comprehend. Unbelievable. I applaud you, because life is good. Like, I'm glad we're not burning it to the ground, but I don't know how you do it. Anyway, so, there's a group of men gathered around to talk about love. And just for the record, some of it is a little comical, like Aristophanes' account. It's impossible to talk about the symposium and not talk about Aristophanes. So Aristophanes says that the original human beings had 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 heads. And the way they would move is they would go hand to hand to feet to hand, and they would just roll. And they would go everywhere. And the heads were turned the other way, just for the record, so our faces were facing each other, and because we were attached back to, it was like a human being, like 2 people attached back to back, and you would just sort of roll everywhere you went. And the gods had been very specific. You cannot go up Mount Olympus. Don't go there, ever. And of course, that's exactly what we do. We go rolling up Mount Olympus. And so Zeus pulls out a big sword and goes and cuts every human in half and then spins their heads. So they're facing this way now. And that's what love is, according to Aristophanes, is you spend your life trying to find your other missing half. That's cute. It's really dumb, but it's cute. Right? Because it's that whole, oh, we were meant to be together. Oh my God, I'm talking about a dumb idea. Think about how arbitrary and random it is when you find a person that you like. It has nothing to do with meant to be together. Anyway, that's such a toxic idea. Because then what it does is it encourages you to stay in a bad relationship you should have dumped a long time ago. Anyway, and it's overly sentimental and sappy. In any case, having said that, there's a more important discussion going on in Symposium. So it turns out that there were 2 Aphrodites. Not 1, but 2. There's the older Aphrodite and the younger Aphrodite. The older Aphrodite was the goddess of love of a thing for the sake of the thing. In other words, it's unconditional love. The younger Aphrodite is the goddess of eros and philos. So eros, of course, is erotic love. It's the lusty love that you have. I don't know if we should even call it love. It's lust, right? It's mostly just chemicals firing off in your brain and the rest of your body. And then there's philos. And philos, according to the Greeks, is love for a thing because of its virtue. You love the thing because of its essence. So, for example, philosophia, Sophia is wisdom, it's the love of wisdom. It's that kind of love. It's utilitarian in essence, right? Because you love it because of what it is, because of its qualities. And then but then there's the other Aphrodite. She's the goddess of what we would probably today call agape. Agape was coined in the ancient world, but after Plato, so he didn't use the term agape, but a lot of translations will just stick agape in there. Agape is that unconditional love. Now, here's what the Greeks said at the symposium. Everybody was capable of eros and philos, but women were not capable of agape. That a woman could only do eros and philos. So in other words, if you're a man and you want to have a relationship that includes you receiving agape, the only way to do that would be to have a homosexual relationship. Because you could have your eros and your philos in that homosexual relationship, and because the other person is a man, he could return the agape you gave him. So that made homosexual love the most superior form of love. Heterosexual love was the next. It was inferior to homosexual love because a man could express agape to his wife, but because his wife was incapable of agape, it could not be returned. And then, of course, lesbian love was the least valuable because there was no agape involved whatsoever. So after reading the symposium as a kid decades ago, the first thought that popped into my head, you probably had this thought, was, had the Greeks never seen a woman with her child? Like, if ever there was agape, it's the relationship a mother has with her children. Like, holy crap. But, and then I understood this later, they would have responded to my question with, have you ever seen a dog with her pups? That, in other words, it's just animal instinct. It's not really agape. Isn't that intense? This is a level of misogyny that's hard for me to sort through because automatically it renders women inferior in every way. Like, women can't even express the same kind of love men can, which is kind of the opposite of what we believe in our society today, I think, at some level. We think that men are incapable of this, that men are just utilitarian, and that men do philos and eros. So it's interesting how our culture has kind of flipped this around, but you have to remember the Greeks were one of our founding cultures. So I think there is, in fact, an undercurrent of that belief still amongst us. I have heard on more than one occasion men say, I do believe women can do agape, just not to their husband. That at the end of the day, that marital relationship, the man can only experience philos because there's too much to be gained economically out of that relationship. What's interesting is, for the longest time, there was data to kind of support this. In relationships where a woman made more money than a man, the length of that relationship's existence was always shorter than where the man made more money than the woman. Having said that, 3 years ago, that reversed. And so for the last 3 years, when a woman makes more money than her partner, the relationship lasts longer. So that suggests that may be at least breaking down in the data, that it's not a consistent rule. But right, that was data that people would point to and go, see, there's no agape in marital relationships. Having said that, we need to go to Aristotle. So Aristotle says that women are deformed males. That what happens is women's bodies are essentially cold, inert material that is lifeless. That they have the potential for life, but life doesn't. It's hard to imagine. I'm sorry, it's so outrageous. And then what happens is a man comes along and he mates with the woman, and what he's doing is he's imparting heat. And the heat activates the woman's otherwise lifeless body. And if his heat is strong, he'll make a male baby. If his heat is weak, he'll make a female baby. Because he didn't have enough heat to create a fully formed human being. That's like a level of misogyny that, wow, dig yourself out of that. So to be fair to Herodotus, both of these philosophers are after him, right? And it's by a significant amount. We're talking about a century here. But the seeds that led to their misogyny were clearly already there during Herodotus' time in ancient Athens. So just for the record, Herodotus wasn't from ancient Athens. He got asylum in ancient Athens. He was from Halicarnassus. Halicarnassus is the city Artemisia I was from. In fact, when Artemisia I's reign ended, Herodotus was 5 years old. In fact, Herodotus' uncle or cousin, we're not sure whether he was a cousin or an uncle, was involved in a conspiracy to kill Lygdamus II. Lygdamus II was Artemisia I's grandson. And so because his uncle or cousin had been part of this conspiracy to kill Artemisia I's grandson, what happened was Herodotus had to flee. And he fled to Athens. And so I think personally he's just mad at Artemisia. So he portrays her in a negative way because I think he felt like he had license to portray women in a negative way. Like, think about it. He has Xerxes whip the Aegean. That's silly, but it's not sadistic, cruel. But he has Xerxes' wife chop up this woman and do human sacrifice on these young people. Right? The real cruelty he levels at the women. Is there a cricket? The crickets are going. Clearly my lecture is a little boring. So my point in this is, why isn't he saying this kind of nasty stuff about Xerxes? If he's making stuff up, why isn't he aiming the stuff at Xerxes? Why is he aiming at Amistris? Why isn't he aiming the stuff at Lygdamus II? Why is he going after Lygdamus' grandmother? And so here's where I think the answer is. So in Athens at the time of Herodotus, women were not allowed in public, except on special religious ceremonial events. And by the way, there were some ceremonial events where only women were allowed in public, that men were completely banned from those ceremonies. So during those periods, men had to stay inside. But usually, these religious ceremonies were co-ed. Or when women went to fetch the water. And so what women could do is they could leave the house, so they would leave at the same time, right? And they would all go to the same watering hole, and they would sit around the cooler and they would chit-chat. But when they did leave the house to fetch the water, they had to cover their face and their hair. So you know how you're always freaked out about how Muslims make their women cover? Well, the ancient Athenians made their women cover. By the way, the Romans did too. So just for the record. All the way until its actual collapse in 1453. Like, this wasn't just like some brief period in Roman history. Even after they converted to Christianity, they still made their women cover. The only exceptions to this, fetching the water in religious ceremonies, was if you were a prostitute or if you were poor. Poor women and prostitutes were allowed in public. Poor women, of course, were mostly servants, slaves too. Slave women could be out in public. By the way, there were levels of slaves that you could have, and there were actually levels of female sex slaves you could have. Like, pornai was one of the female sex slaves that you could have. I think that was the upper class sex slave. And then there were like, I think there were two other And so you could be ranked as what kind of sex slave you were. And they could totally be in public, but then I think the porn were supposed to cover because they were upper class sex slaves. Anyway. In the meantime, Persia has completely banned slavery, but the Athenians have like different kinds of sex slave. We look to the Athenians, we go, that's who we want to be like. The Persians are like, let's all hang out. No slavery, no human sacrifice. The Greeks are like, killing little children and burying them under temples. What the hell? We need to get pickier about our hero societies. In addition to this, women were so banned from the public in ancient Athens that you couldn't even say a woman's name in public. It was totally taboo and forbidden. In other words, the saying of a woman's name brought her into the public arena, and that was not allowed.
And also impossible if she's lifeless.
If she's lifeless, yeah, right. So I think what happened with Herodotus was the women were an easy target because women were so poorly treated in Athens. And then here were the Persians. Not only did they have a woman leader in the form of Artemisia I, but the Persians also let women into combat. They had a whole division, I think it was like 5,000 Armenian archers. They were all women. They also allowed women who were exceptional to go into combat, Persian women to go into combat. In the meantime, right, the Greeks don't even want their women in the streets. Now, somebody is probably going to point this out, or you'll read it at some point, and you'll run into this. The Persians did make people cover. But I noticed I said people because the men also veiled. It wasn't a gender thing for the Persians. It was a class thing. Upper middle class Persians would cover their face in public because they didn't want the lower class people to see them necessarily. They thought it contaminated them. But men and women did this. So like when the emperor would go into public, he would wear a veil, just so that people wouldn't contaminate him by looking at his face. That's a whole different problem, right? This isn't like the Athenian problem where it's just discussed with women. Anyway, so my point with all of this was to bring this up. So we take Herodotus at his word. We take Plato and Aristotle at their word, except for when Plato points out that there was human sacrifice. And then suddenly we ignore. Ooh, no, that couldn't have happened. The Greeks were perfect in every way. Having said that, it is worth pointing out that the Spartans were shockingly egalitarian when it came to gender. Certainly not as egalitarian that they would let a woman become king. That was not allowed. By the way, the Spartans had two kings. They weren't a monarchy, they were a biarchy. They believed that it was really hard to get two people to ever agree to anything. And of course, they just looked at marriages. And so they figured if you had two kings, they would rarely go, okay, and both agree to the same policy. So when they did, you knew it was good. They felt if they had three, two would just constantly gang up on the third guy. So it had to be two because what that would do is that would limit the number of things that get done. And the Spartans believed that you should not have laws because laws changed society, and the Spartans didn't want change. They hated change. In the event Sparta went to war, one king would become the domestic king and would rule Sparta. The other king would become the war king and take the armies out. Because they knew in a war you couldn't have no decision being made. So they needed the kings to be able to rule. So that's why they would split them up like this in war. But in peace, they wanted no decisions to be made, so they made them agree to everything. Except for that, women had enormous authority. They served on the councils. The councils not only passed law and created policy, but the councils also determined who mated with whom. The Spartans did not believe in family units. So if you were a helot or a slave, you could have families. They didn't care about those guys. But the Spartiate, the ruling class, the 10% of Sparta that ruled, They were ethnically Spartans. Everybody else, the other 90% were not ethnically Spartans. The Spartiate were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to own wealth. They couldn't have jewelry, nothing like that. They were supposed to dress very plainly and never have anything flamboyant. You know how people say that room is so Spartan? That's why we say this, because that's how you were supposed to live as a Spartan. Extremely plain. You were supposed to be really Spartan. Well, when you were born, you were immediately removed from your mother and you were put into a general nursery. And you were never told who your mother was. And then you would just breastfeed from different women. And then that way you grew up as part of a community instead of part of a nuclear family. But you could take lovers. Like if there was a person you really liked, you could be a lover with that person, but you didn't get to choose whom you mated with. There was actually a council of people who voted to determine, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to breed the ultimate human. And so they wanted people to breed in certain ways, just like you breed a dog or a horse. And so the councils would determine, okay, you're mating with so-and-so. Don't get pregnant from your lover. I need you to get pregnant from so-and-so. But the women were on those councils. So as strange as this might sound and as jarring as it might sound to think of, oh my God, there's no motherhood in Sparta, that women still had a major say in how that society unfolded, right? And so it's really interesting to me that the societies that we tend to look down on, the Spartans, I mean, we admire the Spartans, but we don't want to be them. We want to be the Athenians, the Persians. Those are the societies that tended to have more space for women. The societies that we really like, the Romans and the Athenians, were the most misogynistic societies ever. Even the Taliban gave their women more power, or give their women more power, more political power, more cultural power than the ancient Athenians did. Probably the most egalitarian society ever, until Iceland, was the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians allowed women to be pharaohs. They allowed women to be directors of schools. Women in ancient Egypt, just to contrast, because I don't want you just walking away thinking all of the ancient world had this misogyny. It was very specific cultures that had this. Ancient Egyptian women owned their sexuality throughout their life. So in Rome, when a girl is born, her dad owns her sexuality until the day of her marriage, and then her husband owns her sexuality. In ancient Egypt, a woman owns her sexuality her entire life. In other words, if she has premarital sex, that's her thing. If she goes outside of the marriage and has sex with somebody else, tough patooties. That's her thing, because it's her body. She do with it what she wanted. And that's, right, we don't even have that in our society. We actually expect a woman to change her name when she gets married, completely erasing her identity. You know what I mean? Like, I have this family friend that every Christmas they write a letter that says, to Mr. and Mrs. Roy Casagranda. It drives me bonkers. They should be writing to Dr. and Dr. Roy Casagranda. Like, who are these people? Get the titles right. It's so wrong. Okay, it also drives me bonkers for the other reason, which is that my wife did not surrender her identity to mine and subsume herself within mine. Like, why does this happen even? Because you would think, I know this is going to sound crazy here, you would think since women play such a much more important role in reproduction, that we would, if we were going to do it, we would do the woman's name, not the man's name. You know what I mean? The man's role is so insignificant. What we really are is we're sort of like DNA syringes. We just sort of, we're a way to transmit DNA between females. Like, it's a way for females to swap DNA. And then we act like we're the dads and we're so important. And the moms are just sort of whatever. You know, the dads get to name the kids. The wives have to have their names changed. It's so weird. So weird. Since the haplogroup goes down your gender, right? Men get their dad's haplogroup and women get their mom's haplogroup. If you're going to do this, why not give the daughters the woman's last name and the sons the man's last name? Or maybe we need to rethink last names. I want to stop there because I want to do questions and answers. And if I didn't resolve anything for you, that's fine, because I hate answers anyway. They're so boring. I mean, there's that moment when you first get them, you're like, and then, 30 minutes later, you don't care. It's like when you go shopping. You can't, for months you were waiting to buy this one thing, you buy it, and 3 days later, you don't care that you have it anymore. That's what answers are like. So, questions? You have to ask me at least a few, otherwise I'll be heartbroken.
How do you find reliable sources if everyone's biased?
Okay, how do you find reliable sources if everybody's biased? So this is actually a terrible problem. So first of all, there's one thing you can always kind of turn to when it's available, and that's archaeology. Archaeology frequently breaks down what we thought. Like, for example, in all the Spanish accounts of the conquest of the Americas, time after time the Spaniards claim that they wiped out this American army, this Native American army, or that Native American army, strictly with Spanish soldiers. Well, when we go to those battlefields and we dig them up, it turns out that the Spanish showed up with Native American allies, right? So there was this big slugfest where there was 100,000 Mexico warriors fighting 500 Spaniards, and we're like, wow, they really were superior. And then it turns out when we do the dig, there was actually 100,000 Native Americans on the Spanish side fighting the 100,000 Mexico warriors, and that's why they lost. At that point, the 500 Spaniards with their horses and their muskets and their cannon tipped the balance of the battle the other way, because otherwise it would have just been a coin toss who would have won. In other words, there was nothing superior to the Spaniards, it's just they were really good liars. And then the archaeology breaks that down for us. And then there's the alternative sources. So if you find two historical accounts of an event, and they contradict each other, I think what you need to do is you need to ask yourself really hard questions. Like, for example, what was the agenda of this person? Like, what were they going for? Who were they? Like, if they're Herodotus, he's probably trying to appeal to the Athenians. The Athenians were over-the-top misogynistic, so he probably realized he could get a lot of mileage by going after women. He also needs to portray the Persians as bad people, because the Athenians and the Persians were in these epic wars against each other, and there was a lot of hatred between the two sides. So if you can find an alternative source, in the case of Herodotus, I don't know of a good alternative source, but if you can sort of weigh it against what is the bias here. So one time I was in class as an undergrad, and the professor brought up the fact that homeless people in New York City had created a magazine, and they were distributing it. And I think they were charging like $1 a piece or something like that, and it was like a weekly thing. And you could go, you could buy it. And a student raised his hand, and he said, I wouldn't trust anything that was written in it. And my professor went, why? And the student goes, well, because they're going to be biased. And the professor was like, biased? They're going to be biased against what? And he goes, well, I mean, like, they're probably talking about homeless issues, and obviously they have a bias because they're homeless. And the professor went, okay, so if you had a magazine that was going to talk about homeless issues, and it was owned by a super rich white guy in a suit and a limo, would you trust that magazine? And the kid went, yeah, I would. And it was one of those moments where it was like, oh, right? Because I think we have this image of what objectivity looks like, and objectivity has become synonymous with what would a white man believe in this moment? What would a rich, well-to-do, Protestant, heterosexual white man in this moment think? Because that's the narration that we have in our heads now at some level, is we frequently have that narration. So I think one of the things you have to do when you're reading, whatever the source is, because it could be something written recently, is you have to ask yourself, what is the value of the voice that I hear in my head right now? You know, you're reading the textbook about U.S. history, and then you read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, and you're going to hear two radically different voices in your head because the textbook is written from George Washington's standpoint, and then Howard Zinn's book is written from the worker class standpoint. That requires research. You can't just grab a book and start reading it. There was this book that I read about the Aztecs written by Tsevetan Todorov, and he basically just lays out this argument that the conquest of the Aztecs by the Spanish was predetermined, that at the end of the day, the Spanish were superior, the Aztecs were inferior. This was bound to happen. And I'm reading the book, trying not to just throw it across the room, because I want the content, because he has information that I needed access to. But at the same time, the fact that he believed in the inherent inferiority of one side contaminates everything that he's writing. On the other hand, there was a book called The Aztecs, written by Inga Clendenin. And when you read her accounts of events amongst the Mexica, one of the things that comes through is Inga Clendenin clearly loved the Aztecs. The love oozes off the pages. So she'll portray something that the Aztecs did that was just absolutely horrible. And you're like, oh my God, I can't believe they did this. But she also so clearly respects and loves them that you can tell it's not coming from a place of hate. It's not coming from a place of negativity. Her agenda is to show you who they are. And the way you get to that source is you have to get lucky. I got lucky because I had a professor who gave me both books, right? And so a lot of this is just dumb luck. Like if I hadn't, how would I have known about Inga Clendenin had I not had this professor that went, oh, you need to read this. But first he made me read Tsevetan Todorov. Son of a bitch. Because he wanted me to earn Inga Clendenin. I got to tell you, by the time I got through Inga Clendenin's book, like I was in love with her too. Like it wasn't just that she was in love with the Aztecs. She had brought me along. By the way, I highly recommend it. If you want to learn more about the Aztecs, totally read her book. So the answer really is a lot of dumb luck is useful. I would ask people you trust, ask people you don't trust, because you're going to get a wide variety. Do not go to Amazon and do a search. I actually did this as an exercise the other day. I don't even remember what the topic was. There was a lot of self-published just garbage on the topic. Like I don't know how you'd sort through what was true and what wasn't true. That just looks like a horrific nightmare. The danger of self-publication is, anybody can do it now. There's no filter. It's scary. Anyway, any other questions?
What are some of the more notable Persian philosophers?
What are some of the more notable Persian philosophers? Okay, so I only know post-Arab conquest Persian philosophers. And then, like the most famous would be Al-Khwarizmi. He's the guy who invented algebra and zero and Arabic numerals and algorithms. Al-Farabi, his Latin name is, Al-Khwarizmi's Latin name is algorithm. Al-Farabi's Latin name is Al-Farabius. Al-Farabi was the Persian who basically cracked the idiomatic coding in Greek texts. So when Aristotle lectured, he lectured by idiom, right? Like a stitch in time saves 9. When you hear a stitch in time saves 9, you're like, 9 what? 9 cats? Like what is that even? A stitch in time? Like you have this image of a clock and a guy's trying to thread a needle through it and stitch that time. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And what it is if you have a threadbare loose on your button and you put one stitch into it instead of waiting for the thing to unravel, right? Then you don't have to put 9 stitches to put the button back on. In other words, maintenance is a hell of a lot cheaper than letting the bridge collapse and having to build a brand new bridge. Something y'all are going to find out soon, since we're about $4.5 trillion behind in maintenance upkeep in the United States. Don't worry about it. Don't fix it. Keep your taxes low. Lower them Lower them. Let the debt skyrocket out of control and let your bridges collapse. It'll be fine. Trust me. The worst that'll happen is you'll discover the taste of human flesh. Or you'll be the person being tasted, I guess. That's the worst. Because that'd be worse. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Just because Houston's going to be underwater in a few years, that'll just make the world a better place. And coral reefs, who needs those? Screw the right whale and polar bears. The coral reefs we're going to miss. Anyway, whatever. Think about this. All the trade from Canada to Russia that can happen over the open Arctic Ocean. You know what I mean? Once the polarized cap is gone, who needs that? What was your question? Oh yeah, so what Al-Farabi did was, he did the stitch in time saves 9 thing. He did those idioms. If you just hear an idiom, you can't know what it means without knowing the backstory, right? So nobody could read the Greeks. They especially couldn't read Aristotle because that's how he talked. He just talks in idioms. Al-Farabi was so brilliant, he actually figured out what the idioms meant, which is why we can read him today. If somebody hadn't broken those ancient Greek idioms, it wouldn't have mattered how much Greek you knew, you would never know what Aristotle was saying. And he's the code breaker that figured out the idioms. Ibn Sina was another Persian philosopher. He's the guy who created modern medicine. He wrote a book called the Canon of Medicine. Qanun at-Tib. Canon is actually Arabic. It just means law. The canon with 2 ends. 3 ends is the thing that goes boom and sends stuff flying through the air and kills people. That's different. Canon with 2 ends just means law. So the canon of medicine literally means the law of medicine. He wrote it in 1025 AD, and it's still read throughout the Middle East and Europe in medical school. And a bunch of the cures that he put in the book we still use today. In fact, he's the guy who is doing cataract surgery. Those are the only 3 Persian philosophers I can think of. I'm sure the list is actually longer. I think we're missing the pre-Islamic Persian philosophers in large measure because those books have sort of been lost to us, or they were burnt. But again, I'm not a full expert, so who knows? There's probably a bunch of material out there that I'm just not aware of. Any other questions? One more. Please make me, yes.
Would you happen to know the name of that German historian that kind of falsified the name of the Roman Empire?
Okay, so the name of the German historian who came up with the term Byzantine Empire and changed the way we think about the end. You know, the name that's popping into my head is Wolf, W-O-L-F, Wolf, but that could be totally wrong. That's the name in my head, but you know what? If you send me an email, I'll look it up. It's not. You could probably just go look it up. German who coined the phrase Byzantine Empire. That's probably all you need to do. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there any active protest against that false state, or is it just generally accepted?
You mean I protested every chance I get in lectures. The other thing I'm doing right now is I'm protesting writing women out of history by writing novels that have women from history in it. So that makes me think of this. I don't think it's enough to write fiction set in the future that put women into positions of power. I think that's great. I think it's really meaningful to be able to see those roles. But the problem with it is the Wonder Woman effect. The problem with it is it makes you feel like you have to be a superhero to achieve. I'm scared of superheroes. I think superheroes have a really negative impact on us. Because, first of all, I believe it's human nature to be polytheistic. That in our hearts, we all want to worship Zeus and Apollo and Artemis and Athena. And when we got rid of those gods, we had to replace them. So we created saints so that we could have them. But now saints are kind of not very fashionable, so we replace the gods again with superheroes, to the point where some of the superheroes are actually gods, like Thor, right? But think about it, Superman, how is Superman not a god? He's totally a god. The superheroes are gods. There's a Batman who's a faker. But you know, right? They have these godly powers. Like you watch a superhero movie, it's just people punching each other across the, you know, like boom, and Loki flies, and then boom, and Batman goes, and it's the kind of combat you would expect gods to have as they're smashing it out with each other. And so I'm nervous about that, and so I'm always worried about stuff like, you know, these unrealistic heroines. I'm also worried about the effects of unrealistic heroes, which is one of the reasons why I think we need to go mining in history. Because if we're bringing up a real person and then showing you that person and what they pulled off, and then showing you all the hard work and not making it out to be they were just born with a shit ton of talent, right? Like Star Wars is all about there's good and there's evil, there's nothing in between, and everybody just magically has talent. Luke Skywalker is magically talented. Rey is magically talented. Like there's no, they didn't earn it. They didn't have to, that's not how history works. You have to earn it. And I'm worried about these narratives, and that's one of the reasons why I think we need to go back in history and mine. We need to find the truth, figure out what the truth was as best as we could, take those people and then bring them into our literature so that people can say their names and then be inspired by them, but also normalize it. The fact that we were having this, when will we have our first woman president, the conversation in 2016 was really weird at some level because it's so alien for us to comprehend having a woman president. Why? There were women pharaohs. There were women emperors. You know what I mean? Like, there's a rich history of women leading that don't always end in disaster. Because when you think about it, usually when we talk about women leading, it's women like Cleopatra the Seventh, and then the next thing you know, she's taking an asp and stabbing herself in the chest to kill herself. And that probably didn't happen, by the way. That's almost certainly not true. She probably did kill herself. She probably just stabbed herself to death or something. Or, you know what I mean? Like, that's a really shitty way to die, cobra to the chest. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes you survive cobra bites. Or Joan of Arc, right, where she gets burned to death for wearing men's clothing. So we have these images of women that were powerful, but then something bad happens to them. What we need to do is also resurrect the stories where there is no bad ending. Or the bad ending happens because it kind of happens to all of us, kind of bad ending, as opposed to, like being burnt to death at the stake. And then make those normal so that we're not freaked out about, oh, geez, could we ever have a woman president? But that also shows you how misogynistic we are, right? That we even can't even comprehend this. Pakistan had Benazir Bhutto as their prime minister twice. They've had one woman twice. Bangladesh has had two different women. Both are Muslim countries. Right? The prime minister of Turkey, there was a woman at one point. Indonesia had a woman. There are multiple Muslim countries that have had women leaders already. Germany is one of the most sexist countries I've ever been in. They have a woman now. India had a woman. Like, oh my God. Philippines had a woman. Like, surely this is normal enough now that we can make this happen. England's had two. England, the guys who did Brexit. Not very smart, clearly. They pulled this off. If England can do it, anybody can do it. They did Brexit. That's almost as bad as voting for some of the presidents we've elected. And it's not one. It's a series of bad presidents. Like, this has been a terrible experiment. We need to stop. Anyway, any more questions? One last one. No? Yes?
I don't know quite how to word this question, but I was having a conversation with a gentleman, and he stated that in order to get over racism, like it was about time that we had like a black president, right? So in having that, okay, black people have had their time to shine, and it's acceptable now, so racism can end. Do you in any way think that by having a woman president, like it would help society accept it? And I don't know.
Okay, so So you had a conversation with a guy who said that the way we end racism is by having a black president. So then if we had a woman president, would that end sexism? So I just want to point out we're about as racist as we've been in 100 years right now. So that clearly did not work out well. I actually think there was a little bit of a pendulum swing event here. But it's hard to describe because one of the strange things about Trump voters is a lot of them voted for Obama. So, like, wait, what happened? You changed your mind on this? I think it's really absurd to assume that sexism would go away if we elected a woman president. I actually think we will see a spike in sexism. Every time she does something wrong, people will be like, well, she is a woman. You know what I mean? So I actually think we have a lot more work we need to do before we're ready to not be a misogynistic society that has nothing to do with who our leaders are. Just like we have a lot of work we have to do on race before we stop being a racist society. Just for the record, Obama was also half white, and I think we're so caught up in our racism that we sort of still do the one drop rule. And so, in our mind, he was just black. There was no whiteness to him. And in the case of Hillary Clinton, right, I think people would have constantly associated her with Bill. There would have been no way for her to get out from his shadow. And she came with so much baggage. It was probably the best that she didn't win. I think in 2020, we're going to need to come up with a better woman candidate than Hillary. One with a little bit less baggage, you know what I mean? But in any case, I don't think that'll solve sexism at all. I think it'll be stronger. I think we need to brace for more sexism before this is over. What would be nice to see probably would be to see more accountability in our legal system so that it's easier for women to report on men, and then it's easier to prosecute those men so that men have more incentive to stop being violent to women. I think that would be a more effective thing. But to do that, we'd need to have the ability to run that legislation through. And we've already seen what the Trump administration has done. Trump, under Betsy DeVos, actually lowered the standards by which a university can kick a person out who's been accused of sexual assault. Because in the last year of the Obama administration, I think it was 2016, they increased the ability for schools to throw potential sexual assault, people who are accused of sexual assault, even if they're not convicted of sexual assault, they could still be kicked out of school. And Betsy DeVos hates that, right? She's a protector of rapists, so she went out of her way to repeal that. Just for the record, schools like ACC have refused to change the policies. So we still have the Obama administration policies in effect. And we're not going to switch over to Betsy DeVos's repeal. So there's schools that are effectively in a state of rebellion. So for those of you who are planning on becoming a person who does sexual assault, I just want you to know you're probably a mistake right now. I would wait until Trump becomes king for life. I think then it'll be clear. President for life. King for life is redundant. This was brought to you by the Department of Redundancy Department. And on that note, I bid thee farewell. Thanks for coming.